Hi, my name is Sneha Rinkumar, and for my oral book report, I read the book Fashionopolis, The Price of Fast Fashion and the Future of Clothes by Dana Thomas. Dana Thomas is a fashion and cultural journalist and author who has been in the industry for about 3 decades now. She has served writing for The Washington Post, The New York Times, and Harper's Bazaar about the fashion world and about design history. She's also written 2 other books about this subject, one being Deluxe and the other being Gods and Kings. This book in particular is an encapsulation of the causes and consequences of the fashion industry, looking at how fast fashion and high fashion are both different, about how fast fashion is able to play a role in our global environment and our human population, and the innovations and technologies that are leading change in the fashion world right now. I'm pretty sure fast fashion is a term that we've all heard, but fast fashion basically encapsulates the affordable clothing that we're able to get through places like Walmart, Forever 21, Target, H&M, Zara, and a lot of other affordable clothing places. We all have fast fashion in our closets, and it's the way that most people are able to afford clothing in a working class. But the effects of mass production like this on human rights and the populations that depend on it are devastating, as many fast fashion companies outsource their manufacturing to third world countries and places where there is an unregulated work and condition environment, and workers need these sorts of jobs in order to be able to make a living. And so they live under hard conditions, and they exacerbate the amount of environmental effects that happen as a place of those. But this book looks at how fast fashion perpetuates these effects and how there are innovations ahead of us. Dana Thomas in this book also recalls her experiences traveling the world and going to different places such as Bangladesh and Ho Chi Minh City, meeting with a variety of people all around the world in order to encapsulate their experience as well in this book. So chapter 1, Ready to Wear, mainly is an introduction on the design world and the history behind the apparel industry specific to America. It discusses the works of different influencers, one, for example, being Mary Catranzo, who is a London-based women's wear designer that is the blueprint for most of the high fashion trends these days, yet is not given any credit because of the fast fashion companies that take her ideas and are able to sell them at a much cheaper price for way more mass production. So she's an example of what chapter 1 really talks about in terms of influencers in the fashion industry, as well as the effect of the history on the fashion world and manufacturing. Discussing the history of modern manufacturing industry in America, it starts by talking about the Boston fashion mills that were instituted there and how fashion in the ways of the public changed from like the Civil War to World War II to the 50s, and how it came around and came in popularity to ready-made clothing. It talks about quick response manufacturing and the NAFTA laws, which were in effect to try to bring manufacturing back to America, but ultimately it ended up being subsidized and outsourced to other places because it ultimately ended up being cheaper and way more effective in delivering to the mass amounts of demand. Chapter 2, titled The Price of Furious Fashion, discusses the history behind sweatshops and human rights advocacy for factories in the Western world, as well as the reality behind the outsourcing factories all around the world. So we talks a bit about the history behind the consumers' unions' rights. For example, in 1890, the Consumers League of New York City nonprofit was founded to combat exploitations and health concerns for human rights workers. Florence Kelley was a major advocate for, as she was part of the first General Secretary of the National Consumers League, she was a huge advocate for rights within human workings. Frances Perkins was another advocate for worker rights. He worked to create the Social Security Act, the Public Works Administration, the Fair Labor Standards Act, all which established health code laws and subjects like minimum wage. But many sweatshops still continued to be in worse conditions and didn't apply to laws. Often in these sweatshops, the security would lock the doors to prevent employee theft, which resulted in disasters such as the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire. This chapter also talks about outsourcing factories outside of the U.S., specifically in Bangladesh. There were a lot of incidents that happened there, in two places specifically, one being the Rana Plaza, which housed 5 garment factories, the collapse of which killed at least 1,000 people and injured more than 25,000. Another being the Tazreen factory fire, in which workers were not allowed to travel within the building, and the casualties and the results ended up being a lot like the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire in America. Chapter 3, titled Dirty Laundry, talks more specifically about cotton and the denim industry and how detrimental it is. One example used is in Ho Chi Minh, where Dana Thomas visits. She visits a jean factory that went through a lot of processes in terms of manufacturing, and in specifics, there was a big chemical use in sanding the jeans as well as dyeing them. Dyeing them specifically would bring the blue dye out, and they would dump the waste into the canals along the side of the factory where the drinking water would come from, essentially. So that was a lot of the environmental impact that was happening through the denim manufacturing in outsourced factories. They also talked about the cotton and the environmental cost of production of cotton, since cotton is one of the most expensive to cultivate because of the amount of water usage and the amount of energy it takes. Chapter 4, Field to Form, talks about takes a diversion from the fast fashion topic of environmental costs and talks more about what is being done now. A term used is slow fashion, so basically curating the experience for the consumer and cutting back on environmental costs, treating workers well, and specifically supporting locally sourced brands and locally sourced materials. The idea is to have vertical integration all in one site, returning to the business model of field to form, which means like from the ground up materials all the way until distribution happening in one singular place. So it localizes a lot of the production and manufacturing that happens to give more of an ethical run. There are some examples that they talk about in the book, specifically two being Natalie Channon and Billy Raid, both of whom are based in Florence, Alabama. Their companies revolve around self-sustainability and e-commerce rather than wholesale. They focus on the vertical integration of using cotton, organic cotton, instead of genetically modified for their companies. And that really contributes towards their sustainability measures. Chapter 5, titled Right Shoring, talks about how this slow fashion process could be brought and be successful in the factory-wide scale, specifically talking about the company English Fine Cottons as a business. They are a modern mill in the UK, a relatively new one at that, the first time in 3 decades that one has popped up successfully. It talks about the idea of reshoring, which is the process of returning manufacturing that had gone offshore or outsourced back to the original state where it came from. So right shoring is more of putting the same vertical twist on it, making sure that vertical integration is involved in terms of locally sourcing the materials and producing them there locally, and manufacturing so that it can all come full scale. Chapter 6, titled My Blue Haven, talks about the other side of the denim production, the side that is working to be better. Specifically, they talk about a company called Genealogia. And Genealogia is working to reduce the amount of water and energy that goes into the production of denim. And they have like a 3-step system, first being lasers that replace the sanding machines, which replaces all the pollution that comes from them. 2 being the ozone chemicals that help reduce the amount of blue dye used. And number 3, e-flow, which is the overall process of reducing the energy amount used to clean and distress denim. Usually 92 million gallons of water a year are what it takes to make jeans globally. But Genealogia wants to reduce the water consumption in jeans by about 71% and the energy output by 60%, and that is something that they're working on. Chapter 7, titled We Can Work It Out, talks about the demand for conscious designs in the manufacturing world and the design world, because sustainability is becoming a lot more integrated in the fashion world, and a lot of people are willing to pay companies that are ethically sourced. So different examples of companies that are in this chapter that are looking to make conscious efforts to reduce animal furs and things like that. One being Stella McCartney and her advocacy against animal use in leather in her company. Another one being Nina Morenzi, who is a Swiss entrepreneur, and she looks into the sourcing of sustainable textiles, along with calculating the cost of materials and the sourcing that goes into them. There's also a company called Modern Meadow, who is looking to create biofabricated materials, specifically lab-grown leather. And they do the work basically by using yeast cells as hosts, and then they create a DNA that goes into them, and they can modify them. So there's no real animal cells needed, which basically eliminates the need for animal abuse in their subject. So that is something that Chapter 7 really touches on. Chapter 8, Around and Around We Go, talks about how clothing can come to a closed loop system where the clothes ultimately get recycled through in a system rather than going in a linear system, and changing life forms as well to reduce waste. A big company that is working on this right now is Evernew, which is a textile innovation company trying to circulate a circular system with high quality recycled cotton that can be reassembled at the molecular level. So when that clothing comes to its life end, it is able to be rearranged, and that is a bit of the technology that Chapter 8 talks about. Chapter 9, Rage Against the Machine, talks about the idea that clothing design can be something that is more accessible to the consumer than ever, using 3D printing specifically. So the 3D printing where clothing can be printed out for the consumer for their own specifications. So there's a lot of innovation with 3D printing and design, specifically by Michael Smith in LA, where he designed the first 3D printed full dress. Lastly, Chapter 10, To Buy or Not to Buy, talks about the democratization of fashion and the trends that cycle in fashion. The democratization basically meaning that the consumers have more of a right now than ever to customize and dictate what goes in the fashion industry. And what they say is it's been exacerbated by social media and companies such as Amazon and Stitch Fix, who are looking to bring the customization close to customers, and that gives them the choice of to buy or not to buy, in the sense that fashion before dictated that buying for each trend was such a monumental and needed step in fashion, but now you can take the choice to look at where you would choose to spend your money and what customizations you'd want to make to your fashion life. So yeah, that's it for the summary. So in terms of the analysis for this book, I wanted to give my thoughts on its intended audience and what it did well and what it didn't in terms of relaying its intended message. So reading the book all the way through, I felt that its intended audience was more for people who didn't have much knowledge on how the fashion industry or the fast fashion industry really worked. The book more so highlights aspects of the history that the average person wouldn't know about clothing. What I originally hoped to get out of reading the book was a more in-depth look at how the fashion industry affects the environmental state of the world, since that was something I had less detailed knowledge about, but unfortunately this book didn't hold a lot of that. It had a lot of the technological advances that the fashion industry had after the fact, as well as more of the human rights look into fast fashion detriments in terms of those. What worked for the book was its intended message of being aware of fast fashion brands. Its intended message was to look at fast fashion with a different lens than you did before, which it definitely paid off in certain ways. One way, I feel like, because of the human rights violation stories in the book and the ways that different companies are combating fast fashion, it makes you look at fast fashion with a different eye, as something more crude and something that isn't likely to be a good source for, the global impact. Through the ways of denim specifically and other apparel, it gave a clear indication that fast fashion is a devastation to the environment. What was lacking in effect for me was some of the discussions surrounding cotton and within human rights and environmental impact. I guess in terms of cotton, a lot of when we talk about cotton, especially in American history, slavery is something that you can't deny. That was a big part of what was garnered the fashion industry here in the first place, and that was why I was able to mass produce so much. And I felt that there was no talk about that at all in the book. When discussing the history behind the American apparel industry and cotton itself, Dana Thomas rarely mentions slavery as a bigger factor. She only really mentions the environmental costs of cotton production and how cotton in itself was a big factor in the fashion mill industry in America, but it just doesn't really talk about the impact of slavery and of that happening. I felt that was something important that it lacked. Another thing lacking was more the environmental impacts, like I stated before. I felt like it more so focused on the surface level idea that environmental impacts were there in Ho Chi Minh City, with the example of blue dye in the canals and people drinking water out of that. That was something that was there, but I felt that wasn't very much lacking in effect. To answer the question if the author changed, reinforced, or caused me to think more previously on the subject, I would say yes and no. Yes, in the sense that it definitely gave me a bird's eye view into fast fashion the fast fashion in the way that it was made and the history that it came out to be. That was something that I had no previous conceived knowledge on before, but no in the sense because I already kind of knew about the human rights effects of fast fashion on the world. But I was just looking to more see the environmental impacts was something that I didn't know. I don't know if I already had the same idea about fast fashion before reading the book, so I don't know if the author changed that for me, but more so she kind of invigorated that more so, right, in the sense that fast fashion is something that I want to avoid personally, and so it made me see the reasons why. One topic that I think is really interesting to note within the discussion of this book in terms of technology being the innovation answer to the fashion industry, it ties back kind of to a topic that we talked on earlier in the semester from Lynn White and his ideas about science and technology not being the answer to our issues. Because or I guess the relationship between science and technology not being the answer to our issues, right? And that relationship being toxic and not using technology to combat the environmental problems we were having. I think that's something that can be applied here because a lot of the talk about of innovation and technology was only geared towards helping the fashion industry rather than that maybe being a detriment. And I think that's something interesting to look at as well, because technology maybe isn't the answer to all our problems, even though there are a lot of technological advancements made in the fashion industry. This book never really touches on whether that is the correct answer or not. Overall, I would recommend this book to somebody who doesn't really know much about like fast fashion and wants to learn more. I would definitely recommend it. If you're looking for a more environmental stance on it, though, I'd check out something else, just because I feel like she doesn't touch on that topic much here. What I learned mainly was a lot of the history and the work that goes, or that the history that went behind fast fashion is in the apparel industry here in the United States, as well as in other places, how the innovation in other parts of the world as well too is really stepping up to hopefully be a future for us. But yeah, this was my review of Fashionopolis. I really hope you enjoyed it.